All right. So basically, for those that are patrons on Patreon, you guys know how this works already. You guys can just ask anything you like. But for those of you that are from Twitter, just enter any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll go through them essentially as I can. I don't have my microphone set up, but if you guys can't hear me or there's any like feedback or anything on the audio, let me know and I'll see if I can fix it. All right. And basically, we're just going to go as long as everyone is still here and interested. So whenever the questions stop, whenever things kind of slow down and drop off, then we'll wrap this up. Usually I find these last like 1 or 2 hours, but usually that's just with patrons. So it might be a little bit longer this time, but we'll see. All right, first question. If you had to choose sardines or oysters, which would you choose and why? So for me, it would definitely be oysters. And this is just based on like a nutrition profile. So like there is something to be said for choosing foods that you think taste better. When it comes down to it, the diet that you're going to stick to is the diet that tastes good to you without being unhealthy. So essentially, when it comes down to it, if you have to choose between the two and you don't really like sardines or oysters, or you're allergic to shellfish or something like that, it's fine to choose one or the other. They're both going to provide benefit. They're both going to provide the omega-3 fats, iodine, all the other things that are associated with seafood that make it so amazing. But oysters, in my opinion, win out kind of objectively from a nutrition standpoint on the basis of having almost the lowest mercury content out of any seafood. I believe scallops beat it out just barely. But literally, even a pregnant woman could eat up to like 10 pounds of oysters per week without hitting the FDA kind of recommended limit for mercury toxicity, where you're anything above that is harming the fetus. So oysters are very, very safe as far as seafood goes. They're even lower in mercury than things like salmon, which are also notoriously low in heavy metals. So that's one thing that makes them really good. And then beyond that, they have a really excellent balance of zinc and copper. As some of you guys may know, there's a balance between zinc and copper, essentially where it's going to regulate each other. So mostly in the fact that zinc is going to deplete copper. If there's too much zinc or not enough zinc, you can have copper overload or copper toxicity. And this is due to the function of a protein called metallothionein, which operates a little bit similar to glutathione. It uses cysteine. Cysteine has what's called a sulfhydryl group, which is a sulfur and a hydrogen group that binds to different heavy metals. And while glutathione just has one of these sulfhydryl groups due to one cysteine molecule being contained in it, metallothionein actually has 30. So zinc fuels the production of this and acts as a placeholder for other metals. And when it encounters a heavy metal or free copper or free iron, it swaps out the zinc with one of those other metals. So basically, intake of both zinc and copper at the same time, especially at several times the daily value, can set you up for days in advance as far as the kind of nutritional balance with these minerals. So oysters have that kind of element that no other seafood has. Liver has a similar or higher amount of copper, depending on like if it's beef liver or chicken liver or something like that. But basically the kind of difference with oysters is that they have the cofactor to keep copper in check at the same time, not to mention a lot of other minerals. So oysters win out there, in my opinion. Let's see, next question. Aside from diet, do you have any methods for exfoliating facial skin to improve texture and color? So this is really more my wife's area of expertise. She, I believe, uses a like topical vitamin C solution or face wash of some kind. Another one that's like a hemp extract with CBD in it. I'm not sure if that has much anti-inflammatory activity in the skin or if it's one of those like marketing gimmicks, but it seems to work. That's what I use personally as well. Vitamin C in the skin can be very protective. It acts as a cofactor for collagen synthesis, but you can achieve the same effect with systemic vitamin C. And then the other thing that we both use, her more than me, but is topical pumpkin seed and argan oil in the skin, which is very, very beneficial in a lot of ways. It's very high in vitamin E and has some anti-inflammatory properties. Pumpkin seed oil in food as well is very delicious. Let's see. Hi, I'm curious as to how to not be anemic without developing high creatinine in levels. That always, I always mess that one up, as I have from a combo of high protein and iron supplementation. So first off, so there's not really an issue, in my opinion, with a high protein diet and kidney function. The issue is more with iron, and I don't recommend iron supplementation at all for partially that reason. It puts a lot of oxidative stress on different systems within the body because the iron oxidizes when it's not fully bound to different proteins like heme or being used in different ways. So the way the body prevents this is actually through the relationship between iron and copper, where iron has two kind of default states in the body. There's the oxidized state where it has lost one electron, where it's not soluble in water. This is called ferric iron. And then it has the soluble state where it is what's known as reduced, which means it has an extra electron compared to the ferric form. And so as a result, it's actually not soluble in water, but it can be bound to proteins and transported around the body. So copper converts iron back and forth between the soluble and insoluble form, and it needs to be in the insoluble form when it's transported. Otherwise, it will become oxidized, where it reacts with oxygen and forms iron oxide, which is a pretty potent free radical and can basically cause different stress to organ systems, the liver, the heart, kind of most notably, but also the brain. It's linked to things like heart disease, neurodegenerative disorders, etc. So you really want to make sure that you are getting a good balance between iron and copper, as well as kind of copper and zinc. So there's kind of a little bit of a trinity between those three minerals that you want to balance. And then vitamin A is also useful as a cofactor for many of the iron transporting enzymes like transferrin, which clears some of the free iron as well. So those are very important, and that would be my main advice. I mean, there's other factors like hydration can affect creatinine. I mean, like it would depend on like carb intake and things like that too. Like a ketogenic diet or something might affect it more by increasing your water demand. So there's other factors, but my main advice would be just keep your protein at something like a gram per pound of body weight is a safe, well-known recommendation. And then lose the iron supplementation, replace it with like red meat and balance of the cofactors from foods like liver. Does eating cholesterol impact cholesterol in the body negatively or at all, and why? So this used to be commonly believed. They used to think that dietary cholesterol was a risk factor for high cholesterol in the body. But then it was found that even if you remove cholesterol completely from the diet, like you have like a vegan diet, it only reduces cholesterol by about 10 nanograms per, I believe it's deciliter, which is essentially like nothing compared to some of the changes that we see with other things. So basically, there's no real need to worry about dietary cholesterol. Now, there are other factors that can affect cholesterol, like the sulfur-containing amino acids, which is one of the things with eggs. Originally, the research with eggs, they thought that it was the high cholesterol content of eggs that was causing, for example, like some of the results they were seeing with cholesterol and heart disease and different things like that. But it seems to be more the methionine content and the other kind of sulfur containing amino acids impacting cholesterol metabolism. So essentially, you don't really have to worry about dietary cholesterol. The things that affect cholesterol are more going to be saturated fat as well as a little bit of other things like smoking, obesity, your exercise, or whether you're exercising or you're sedentary, sunlight exposure, different things like that. How old are you? I am 23. I'll be 24 in January. After being vegan for 20 years, I started eating animal retinol. After a while, my fingernails started turning orange. Is my body rejecting any beta carotene I eat now, or is it craving beta carotene? So I'm not sure if that's linked to beta carotene, but there have been documented cases of, I believe it's called keratinosis, which is basically where you have the keratin build up in the skin. And this is protective in some ways. You have like a reduction in sunburn from UV light because it has, it essentially acts as a chromophore where it blocks part of the light spectrum from damaging cells as much, the UV spectrum, which is potentially oxidizing in excess. So, there could be some benefit to that. It could just be that the beta carotene kind of level you were consuming isn't being used to try and produce vitamin A, because you have to eat a lot of beta carotene to produce vitamin A. The conversion is like 5 or 10% or something quite low like that. And then basically when you are getting more of the like active form, you don't need to really convert as much. So it's possible that the excess is stored in the skin, but I'm not really sure how much you're consuming, so it's hard to say for sure. Even if the iron supplement is beef liver, would you say just eating liver directly is better? So I'm a fan of whole food sources. There are probably some cases out there where someone can be truly deficient in iron, but in most cases, the issue is more so like, even if you're like anemic, anemia is just not being able to produce enough red blood cells to adequately produce like oxygen flow throughout the body. So you get the symptoms like lightheadedness, blood pressure issues, etc. So essentially, there could be theoretically cases where someone was truly deficient in iron, but due to the fact that essentially all wheat products are fortified with iron, most meat contains a good amount of iron. You have all of these other kind of sources of iron, mostly through food fortification, but sometimes you see it through supplements and things like that as well. It's actually pretty rare for people to have true iron deficiency. And our body naturally has an iron recycling system that recycles all but a milligram or 2 of iron per day. So theoretically, if that system is functioning at 100%, you should only need to consume a small amount of iron per day, like only a fraction of what's considered the recommended daily intake. Now, that said, not everyone has that system fully functioning, and there may be some people that have a higher demand for it. I would say eating red meat or beef liver a couple times a week should be enough to get the iron that you need and to maximize its effectiveness through the copper and retinol content of the liver, especially. But you could also, if you absolutely had to take an iron supplement, like you've been trying through all the dietary interventions, vitamin C is another one that you can use because it increases the absorption of insoluble iron, the ferric form that I mentioned earlier. Basically, if you have the vitamin C, there's an enzyme that it acts as a cofactor for called, I believe it's duodenyl cytochrome B, where basically it converts the ferric form of iron back into the ferrous form so it can be taken into the body. So this increases the bioavailability of iron, mostly from plant foods, but also a little bit from meat, by about 5 times. So essentially, vitamin C can help a lot. The copper and vitamin A can help a lot. And if you've tried all that, you've tried increasing your dietary iron intake, and you still can't get there, the only supplement I would ever recommend for iron would be a heme iron supplement, because it's not going to oxidize easily the same way that a ferrous sulfate one would, because ferrous sulfate is already in the soluble form that's very reactive right off the bat. Let's see. Excess iron isn't healthy, but does not getting enough bioavailable iron still pose other risks, as in plant-based vegan diets? Yes, kind of goes back to what I was just saying. If you have a lack of the cofactors, that can cause more issues in most cases. Like you could still theoretically, if you had enough vitamin C and copper and retinol, get enough of the iron from a vegan diet, but the hard part is you're automatically going to be deficient in retinol. You may have lower copper because copper in plant sources is often bound to phytic acid, which prevents it from being absorbed. So there's kind of an inherent deficiency in the cofactors in a lot of cases, aside from vitamin C, which is more abundant in a vegan diet. But essentially you would have the main risks that you would see would be those of anemia. So it would be both the side effects, and then there's an interesting relationship between iron and heart disease, where you see higher levels of iron, especially stored iron in the form of ferritin on your blood work, being linked with heart disease more so. But over time, when you get older, actually having lower iron or lower red blood cells, like clinical anemia, can actually increase your risk of cardiac events. So the worst kind of iron, I guess, like intake format or whatever you want to say, the iron kind of metabolism pattern that you see for heart disease is actually high iron stores and high iron intake for most of your life. And then when you get about the age where heart attack and cardiac arrest and things like that become very common, then you see basically an increased risk when you are anemic or when you can't get enough of the red blood cell production and things like that. So the key thing is keeping iron intake low for most of your life. And then later in life, it becomes harder and harder to maintain the cofactors for iron, like retinol and copper and things like that. So it's important for you to be able to keep up with those as well, especially like after age 60 or so, when it becomes more of a risk. Will this video be posted on the channel afterwards? I'd like to come back since it's late here in England. I believe I can do that, yes. I think it's being recorded, though I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, if not, I don't know if you're a patron of mine or not, but I also am going to be doing another one for patrons on Patreon on Thursday at about the same time, a little bit later, about like 5 p.m. Eastern time. So if you missed this one and I'm not able to upload it, which I think I can, but I'm not 100% sure on that, then you can also join that one if you are. So if methionine / sulfur-containing amino acids impact cholesterol levels, does that mean eating those are bad? It's more an issue in that case with methylation. So basically, with methylation, the waste product produced by methylation is called homocysteine. So homocysteine is another one of the risk factors for heart disease. Cholesterol gets a little bit too much attention, in my opinion, compared to some of the other risk factors like iron and homocysteine. The way homocysteine operates is it reacts with elastin and collagen, which are proteins in connective tissue and really just general cells throughout the body that make up a lot of the vascular system. So it actually destroys the integrity of the veins itself. And it can also kind of, as a result, cause a little bit of oxidative stress and damage to lipoproteins, not the lipid content per se. It may affect the lipids as well, but it will affect the protein content actually of the things like LDL particles. So homocysteine, similar to high iron, can increase the damage to cholesterol particles and make them more likely to implant. And it's produced by methionine metabolism through the methylation cycle. So when you have essentially an increase in methionine intake, this can be good if your methylation is generally low, but if you have trouble keeping up with methylation, then essentially you're going to have an increase in homocysteine that your body isn't clearing properly. The nutrient kind of pathway that is required to clear homocysteine is called the CBS pathway. It metabolizes homocysteine into cystathionine and then into cysteine, taurine, or sometimes the cysteine gets converted into glutathione as well. So that is like a beneficial sulfur-containing amino acid pathway, but that requires B6 as a cofactor. So if your homocysteine is high, you can bring it down with B6, reducing methionine intake if all else fails, or doing other things to stimulate the recycling of homocysteine back into methionine, which is driven by either the pathway called MTRR, which uses methyl B12 and methylfolate together as a cofactor, so you can use a combination of those. Or there's also a pathway called BHMT, which uses betaine, which is a choline derivative, also known as trimethylglycine. So either of those pathways will also clear homocysteine. There's kind of the three options that you have, and each one has different cofactors. But B6 is a generally neutral one, unless you're overmethylated, which you can find symptoms of that on my Twitter if you search my Twitter handle in overmethylation. then if you have those symptoms, I would avoid B6 and favor more of folate. But otherwise, B6 is going to be best for people that don't have any methylation symptoms or undermethylation symptoms. Let's see. What lab tests can people check in a high meat consumption diet to prevent iron overload? So the panel that I use and that some of my like associates and colleagues, I guess you could say, on Twitter, like Grimhood, use is what's called the Full Monty Iron Panel. You can just search Full Monty Iron Panel. There's a website called Request a Test that you can order it through, and then you just go to a local like LabCorp or Quest Diagnostics or one of the like local centers that supports that kind of blood work. So you can pay for it online and then they send it there. You just stop by. It's like a 20-minute process between ordering it and going in for the blood work. So, and that's if you're within the US. Other countries, it may be a little easier, more difficult. But that iron panel includes both all the iron markers, including like ferritin, which is one of the key ones, and the iron cofactors. Otherwise, a lot of common blood work will look at some of the main iron markers like ferritin. The optimal range for ferritin is 20 to 100. What's considered like the normal range goes up to 400, but from a mortality perspective, that's what's ideal. So I'd at least keep track of your ferritin. If you can get the Full Monty Iron Panel, that also includes the copper-containing proteins like ceruloplasmin, transferrin, those different things that are going to help clear the actual free iron itself. And, you know, if all of those are in check and your ferritin's a little high, that's going to be better than having just like the high ferritin and not knowing anything else. So you can kind of figure out like if you need to manage the other kind of cofactors, like let's say your copper containing proteins are low and your ferritin is high or something like that, then that can tell you that you need more copper, and that might help kind of clear the metabolism a little bit. Though generally it's a safe bet to say you can reduce iron consumption, or you can also use some supplements to reduce excess ferritin. Like the most effective one I found is the IP6, which is also known as phytic acid, but it's a purified form, so you don't have to worry about nutrient loss from food. You can just take it kind of away from your first meal of the day a couple hours before that in the morning. Why exactly is plant protein inferior? When I eat tofu/beans as my protein, one day I'm very fatigued. Meat and dairy another day equals much more energy. Why exactly? So plant protein, you can survive on it, but it doesn't contain the full spectrum of amino acids that we are used to. And that includes some of the things like methionine. So in some cases, you can actually limit your methylation, which impacts your neurotransmitter levels. The methylation neurotransmitter kind of relationship is pretty linear, where your serotonin and dopamine levels are closely associated with how high or low your methylation is. And this has to do with how much the transporter proteins that clear them away from the receptors are expressed. When you have low levels of methylation, those transporter proteins become overexpressed. So you end up actually seeing a greater metabolism of serotonin and dopamine, more so serotonin. You'll almost certainly get the low serotonin symptoms like OCD tendencies, addictive personality, like perfectionism, ruminating thoughts, different things like that. But in some cases, you'll also see dopamine. Dopamine can be impacted by other neurotransmitters or just like general lifestyle habits, like, you know, whether you're a smoker or not, things like that. So serotonin's the most reliable one that affects like the personality symptoms and things like that the most. But in general, methylation, even on a day-to-day basis, can affect that. And then there's other amino acids that play a beneficial role too, things like glycine and others that may or may not be found in high enough quantity in plants to really meet the optimal level that your body needs to sustain itself. So you can get the essential amino acids, but when you leave the body left to synthesize all the others for itself, first off, you're depleting the nutrients required for those pathways more than you would be otherwise. And then secondly, some of them actually may directly affect mental health. So all of that ties together and makes animal-based proteins more optimal in a general sense. And if you get a range of different types, like dairy protein, a little bit of meat, something like that, that's going to provide you the best balance of different amino acids. Is cow milk, in parentheses, raw, inflammatory? A lot of people seem to be suggesting that goat dairy may be superior, but I don't have access to this. So yes and no. I think if you search my name on Twitter and the word dairy, you should find a study I posted the other day that basically covers this. So essentially, the conclusion when we pool all the different RCTs on dairy consumption is that milk itself, even if it's cow milk, does not raise inflammatory markers except in a subset of the population that is sensitive to cow dairy. So generally, if you have like, what's considered like lactose intolerance or other kind of non-classified inflammatory reactions to cow dairy, which would be usually a result of casein, which is one of the proteins in cow dairy, which in some people acts as an antigen. So essentially, when you have an increased consumption of the casein form in cow dairy, for some people that can trigger an inflammatory response. For other people, they aren't kind of predisposed to be able to metabolize lactose easily, and that can also create an inflammatory response. But if you're not part of that subset, there's no evidence that it's inherently inflammatory. There may be some forms of dairy, like cow dairy, that are better in general. Like kefir, for example, is almost always going to be more anti-inflammatory than other forms of dairy or just kind of general dairy. But when it comes down to it, the best kind of way to go about dairy consumption, in my opinion, is to start off with cow dairy, or if you have access to it and the money to spend to actually use it, you can use goat dairy. But if you have a bad reaction to cow dairy, then you can switch to goat dairy, fermented dairy, or fermented goat dairy to kind of see if that alleviates it. Because fermented dairy, like kefir yogurt, is going to have less of the lactose. And then the goat dairy is going to have the other form of casein that's not inflammatory. You can also use, I believe it's called A1, it's either A1 or A2. There's another form of cow dairy that you can find that has a different kind of variation of the same casein protein, so it doesn't cause the same issues. So either way, like if you are someone who is sensitive to dairy and do have that inflammatory response, it is possible to kind of hack it with just like varying the type of dairy you consume, or between cow and goat dairy, or just getting like the A1 or A2 version instead of the normal. But essentially, for most people, it's not an issue. Personally, I consume cow milk because it's more affordable, though I do prefer goat milk for the taste, and it's slightly better from a nutrient perspective, but it's not going to make or break anything. It's like a little bit more potassium, maybe a little bit more protein, some stuff like that. I was vegan for decades and my ferritin was 5 then. I'm thinking I can do with a lot more iron now. Yeah, like I said, from a mortality perspective, 20 to 100 is optimal. So you need to get it up to at least 20. It doesn't have to be that high, but like somewhere in that range is going to be ideal from the heart disease perspective, and probably other disease as well. I'd love to hear anything you've learned to be generally helpful for most people. Any less known one-size-fits-all tips and facts for all humans to improve their well-being. Fascinating general truths. I like this one. This is a very thought-provoking question. So right off the bat, I'd say the biggest thing that I found is sunlight exposure. Really, I don't think there's any health condition I've seen where sunlight exposure isn't beneficial, so long as it's below the point of sunburn. And really, this is the only risk to sun exposure, is sunburn. And sunburn only, even then, increases a small percentage of cancer overall, in the sense that skin cancer is a very, very minority as far as the cancers in general. And it's one of the least fatal because it's easier to catch. And generally, unless it's caught very, very late, it's going to be treatable without being fatal or metastasizing. So there's no real risk if you aren't getting sunburned to sun exposure. And the benefits to it are just so numerous and so beneficial that there's really nothing, there's no argument against it, in my opinion. And, I could go on all day about the benefits. I have a lecture on them in my YouTube. It kind of touches on a lot of things, but it's basically a lecture on mitochondria and how they relate with light. And then, just optimizing your circadian rhythm in general, like avoiding artificial light, especially at night, but even during the day. The isolated blue light spectrum is going to cause a lot of problems with both your circadian rhythm regulation, because it acts as a wakefulness signal to the body, but then also to the mitochondrial function, because the blue light spectrum actually can slightly impair energy production and be a source of oxidative stress. And it's not going to penetrate as deep as the red light spectrum. Red light can actually affect up to between 60 and 100% of the body, whereas the blue light spectrum, it's much less, but it can still cause issues in some cases. So avoiding artificial light at night would be another. I'd say a couple other things. Eating a balanced omnivore diet for most people is extremely beneficial. Eating more seafood, especially, another thing where, like, unless you're eating high mercury seafood, there's really no argument against seafood. And I've shared a link before where you can actually see on the FDA website, they have all the seafood organized from highest to lowest mercury content. So if you eat at the lower end of that chart, then you're pretty much home free as far as the toxicity risk. And it's like, you could, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, for those of you that were here, there's actually like so much leeway with some of the things like shellfish, which is very, very low in mercury in general, that even a pregnant woman could eat up to 5 or 10 pounds of some shellfish like oysters or scallops per week with no negative repercussions for the fetus at all. So there's some things like that are just very, very broadly beneficial. The only other things that would be probably magnesium and probably thiamine as well. Like, those are two supplements that I would say are extremely beneficial. Magnesium, just in the sense that it's the most used nutrient by the body, used in a little over 40% of all the chemical reactions in the body, which, just when you think about cross reactions, because it's not like you just have isolated chemical reactions happening. They happen in kind of chains that take a molecule from one thing into another. So if you think about that, then you realize that it's far higher when it comes to how many different types of reactions and things are actually affected by magnesium. So it's as much as like, probably close to 100%, 90+% of chemical reactions are affected by magnesium deficiency, to the point that severe magnesium deficiency is associated with with increased risk of almost all disease. So that's something else that's highly beneficial. And then I'd honestly say that implementing like a neurogenesis increasing protocol, even if it's just simple stuff, like some supplements that increase neurogenesis are extremely well tolerated, to the point that I would say most everyone could use them. There's like, I'm not sure I would say they are all known to be safe for children or pregnant women or things like that. So there's a little bit more of an exception when it comes to this. But things like ginseng or lion's mane or things like that are just so broadly beneficial from a neurogenesis standpoint that I think they could help a lot of people, both from a prevention standpoint for neurodegenerative disease and probably also from just a more broad cognitive enhancement kind of effect. So neurogenesis enhancement, things like that, can also be beneficial for pretty much everyone, in my opinion. How do we find our methylation status? You can either use a histamine test. I prefer whole blood histamine for my clients that I do consults with. Or you can also use what's called a methylation panel, which the key thing that looks at is what's known as your SAME to SAH ratio. The methylation cycle essentially consists of methionine getting converted into SAME. SAME acts as the universal methyl transporter, so it carries methyl groups around the body and gives them up for different reactions. And in the process, once it loses its methyl group, it becomes SAH, which is an analog of homocysteine, and then SAH just gets broken down into homocysteine itself, which is the waste product of methylation. So then homocysteine either gets metabolized out of the cycle or it gets reconverted back into methionine and the cycle starts again. So SAME in relation to SAH can tell you the most kind of precise amount of information about the methyl cycle itself. So if your SAME is higher relative to your SAH, like if the SAH is in the low normal range, the SAME is in the high normal, then that will tell you essentially that your methylation is high. Whereas if it's the inverse of that, then it'll tell you it's low. Otherwise, elevated histamine has an inverse relationship. So high histamine means low methylation. Low histamine means high methylation. And this is also very reliable. I use both with clients. It really depends what you can access. But either one, it's fairly easy to analyze. You really just have to look at the SAMe to SAH ratio. Sometimes the methylation panel will include other things like your homocysteine level or thionine or folate or different nutrients that are related to methylation, but most commonly it at least includes the SAMe to SAH ratio. So that'd be the blood work that I would get. How do I determine how much IP6 and inositol? I assume that's the dosage with each, but so IP6 is an analog of inositol. Phytic acid, as it's also called, is an analog of inositol. Basically, some inositol is going to be converted into IP6 in the body, but it's only a very small percentage. So you can get additional benefit from taking a bit higher dose of IP6 as a supplement. Now, I'm not 100% clear that much of it or any of it at all is absorbed. I do believe some is when it comes to IP6, but even in the supplemental form, it's not really going to be soluble in water because it's going to have to be bound to other minerals, usually a combination of magnesium, sodium, and either calcium or potassium. So that keeps it stable as a powder, and you can just capsule that up or buy it pre-made in capsules. And I would do between 500 and maybe like 2 or 3 grams, 500 milligrams and between 2 or 3 grams of that per day. So somewhere in that range, start small with it because it will reduce your iron pretty significantly. And basically, you can use that for different purposes, mostly though for iron reduction. And it has some antioxidant and potentially some anti-cancer activity as well. This is probably where a lot of the benefits of different like nuts and seeds and things like that come from. Some of the phytic acid from them may be absorbed because there is evidence showing that a little bit of phytic acid can be metabolized, just different ways, but most likely through either the gut microbiome having enzymes that can break it down, or just through kind of some general instability in the gut, allowing a little bit of it to be broken down. But with inositol, the dose range is much higher. Some people are very sensitive to it. I've only ever encountered this in bipolar individuals, but if you're someone who's very sensitive to the kind of stimulating effects from it, then it's important to start small, like only like a gram or something. A lot of the capsule supplements are sold in these like tiny doses, like a gram or so. But for most people, you can tolerate much more. So for the average person, I would just buy essentially powder, powdered inositol, and basically from there you can actually use it as just starting with like a teaspoon per day and working your way up. The highest I've ever heard or used personally is like 5 or 6 tablespoons per day, but for most people, somewhere in the range of like 1 to 3 tablespoons per day is going to be fine or optimal. And it's about half as sweet as sugar, so you can also use it as a sugar replacement. Just double the dose of sugar or double the dose of inositol related to sugar. So what's your view on raw liver consumption, diminished micronutrients in cooked ones? So with the raw food, it's kind of a risk benefit thing. And we're talking about like raw meat and to a lesser extent, raw milk specifically. So with raw meat, there is a little bit of nutrient loss with cooking. Now, some of these things like liver are just so high in these nutrients, and you're really only losing it from like the vitamin aspect of it. So you might lose a little bit of like vitamin A or the B vitamins, but it's already extremely high in those nutrients. And the mineral content isn't going anywhere unless you lose a little bit of like the juice from the inside of it. And then even if you do lose some of the juice, fat soluble nutrients stay in the fat. So like if it's a steak or something too, it's not going to lose any fat soluble nutrients like retinol, except maybe a little bit broken down by heat. So some people will exaggerate the nutrient loss from like raw meat or things like that. And really it's not much, like maybe 10% at most based on like what I've seen as far as like the research on this goes. So to me, that's not enough of a difference for me to want to do this. Now, there are some ways where like consuming raw liver might make it more appetizing. I know some people will mix like a little couple, like an ounce or half an ounce little piece of raw liver into like a shake or do like a pate or something like that. And if it's raw in that form, that might be a little bit better. But even then, like similar, it's probably safer to eat it cooked from a perspective of parasite or bacterial contamination. Because with raw meat, the main issue is that you might have, depending on the type of meat, this can be much more of a risk than others, but you can have different types of parasites, either like actual microorganisms or just like bacteria or things like that that are pathogenic or disrupt the microbiome or different things like that. So essentially, it's never really been like a good enough risk benefit ratio for me to want to use it or try it. Raw milk is a little bit better. So there may be some actual benefits to raw milk, but there is still some risk. I've actually had clients that have had bacterial infection or parasite infection from raw meat or raw milk. So this does happen. It's not common, and a lot of the time, even if you did have something like this, you wouldn't know necessarily. Like most people don't eat raw meat and get tested for actual parasite contamination or something like that. But it does occur, and some of them can be really problematic to solve. Like it can take you months or rounds of antibiotics or all this different stuff to try and get rid of something that's causing you like pretty significant issues with like gastrointestinal distress, etc. So to me, it's not worth the risk there for the most part either, though I have had raw milk a few times and I do enjoy it. It really depends, like pasteurization will affect much less of the nutrient content than per se something like actually what they used to do was actually boil raw milk before cooking with it or drinking it or anything like that. So that's actually going to reduce the nutrient content a lot more than pasteurization, which is going to be barely anything, like 1, 2, maybe 3% loss of nutrition. And again, it's not going to affect the mineral content. So really, when it comes down to it, light pasteurization is probably your best bet when it comes to like the nutrient carryover. So dairy, I'd say pasteurized dairy is going to be much better than like I guess like cooked meat from a nutrition loss perspective. But then with meat, there's probably a bigger risk of contamination, parasites, etc. So just be very, very careful with sourcing if you do choose to do something like that, and maybe combine it with antibacterials like garlic or black seed oil or things like that that are known to be protective against some of the different types of pathogens. It's not going to be like 100% risk-free if you do something like that, but it'll dramatically improve any risk you might have. What should I pair it with? I think that's going back to Inositol. You don't really have to pair it with anything necessarily. I just do it in water with like a little bit of sea salt or magnesium or something like that. The combination of inositol with magnesium for some people can be a good way to get past like the saltiness of it, since it's going to have a little bit of a salty taste. Let's see. When I eat certain things, and I'm not sure what it is specifically yet because it seems to be a wide range of different times, it seems to cause crazy ruminating thoughts, anxiety, and fatigue. Is that a histamine response, or what is happening there? It happens every time. It happens even when I'm eating relatively clean. So this, let's see, 1 second. So this indicates most likely a serotonin issue. Rumination is mostly linked to serotonin. Basically, what happens when you have low serotonin, which can be influenced by a lot of things, most commonly methylation. As I mentioned earlier, higher methylation is linked with higher levels of serotonin and to a lesser extent dopamine. Lower methylation is linked with lower levels of dopamine. And basically, you are going to want to essentially look at the content of nutrients that can affect methylation. So the one that I would look out for specifically would be niacin. Niacin binds to methyl groups in the liver through an enzyme called Nnmt. Interestingly, it's one of the kind of newer topics I've been researching is there's a class of drugs called Nnmt inhibitors, which block the methylation depletion from niacin. So there may actually be benefit to that, though it's kind of it goes both ways. Like there are some benefits to the reaction as well. So I'm not 100% sure if it's all safe or effective, but that would be what I would look at, would be like the niacin content, and then folate, having a high intake of folate, things like liver or something like that that's very high in folate. If you're very good at processing the folate, then it may actually be enough that you have an increase in the that you have an increase in the activation of the folate receptor is what causes this. It's basically a reduction in methylation from a genomic kind of regulation standpoint. So it's actually a reduction in the ability of the methyl groups to bind to DNA through activation of the folate receptor. So either too much folate or too much niacin would be the main issue that you could have with that I would kind of directly link to that. It could also be like a glutamate response, like a sensitivity or inflammation or something like that. Neuroinflammation increases glutamate, so there could be some kind of racing thought or anxiety increase from that. But my guess would be it's something impacting serotonin. The fatigue might be inflammation too, though. And, I'd have to look at your diet as a whole to say like the most likely factor, but I would review kind of the B vitamins first. How do you recommend treating hormonally induced edema? So, estrogen increase causes a little bit of fluid retention, so I would start there. There might be another mechanism I'm not aware of, but just off the top of my head, that's what I've seen kind of linked to edema or other types of fluid retention. So, looking at like keeping your estrogen balance or in balance and seeing where it's at, just getting a hormone panel to start off. And then there are things you can do to either increase or decrease your conversion to estrogen. Something that's like a mild one that you could use that would be my go-to would be DIM, which is a diindolylmethane methane. It's a compound found in broccoli and other cruciferous vegetables. And basically, like about up to 200 milligrams, maybe 300, it's a aromatase inhibitor, so it'll reduce the conversion of testosterone into estrogen. And then higher than that, it will actually increase the conversion. So you can use that depending on like where you're at. You can increase or decrease the dose. And there are other over-the-counter aromatase inhibitors. Not saying you should necessarily do that. Obviously, like talk to your doctor, figure out your hormone levels first. But that's something that you could do if it is an estrogen issue. It could also be insulin resistance, which you'd have to either look at your fasting blood glucose, or you could also essentially look at something like so there's another test you can use called a oral glucose tolerance test, which will test insulin resistance before it shows up on your fasting blood glucose if it's like in the early stages. Those would be the main areas I would start with. Are those blue light blocking glasses? No, they are prescription, though I'm working on kind of tapering them down. I honestly prefer to actually filter the like artificial light at the source. So I just use blue light filtered light bulbs or like filtration programs on my computer if I have to work past a certain point. And I try and balance out sunlight exposure with it as well. So like I'll work next to like an open window or outside whenever I can. What's the most fascinating scientific fact / discovery you've learned this year? This is a good one. So this is okay. So this is a little bit out there, but this was actually the topic of the first lecture I ever did on my Patreon. If you guys want to learn more about it, and I've never talked about this on Twitter because it's a little bit out there compared to some other things that I discuss, and I'm not 100% sure I believe it, but there's a concept called biological transmutation, which is backed by a decent body of research that essentially is a form of what's known as cold fusion, which is basically the idea that nuclear reactions can occur below the very high temperatures we see in typical nuclear reactions. And what a nuclear reaction is defined by the conversion of one type of element into another. So it's essentially kind of like the old time version of, I guess like a modern scientific version of alchemy in that sense. Now, we don't see this with most of the common elements found in the body or anything like that. It's not like we have any nuclear isotopes commonly found in the body in any large quantity. There are some, but for the most part, the like magnesium, calcium, and things like that don't really have this property. Now, interestingly, there's a body of research that suggests that essentially you'll see changes in the levels of these minerals in the body if you put like an organism into a closed ecosystem. And the most interesting study I've seen on this, I don't remember the exact minerals they used, but they put like bacteria into a sealed environment where they completely controlled everything that was in it. They documented the amount of the minerals, each mineral and everything beforehand and after the fact. And they put in a certain amount of a particular mineral that's not commonly found in biology, like beryllium or something like that. It was in a much higher quantity than normal. And when they tested at the end, they found a new mineral that wasn't added and also wasn't found in biology, that was like 1 proton away from the actual like atomic number of beryllium, indicating that a nuclear reaction seems to have occurred. So unless these guys were just flat out faking their results, which is possible but unlikely in my opinion, this study would be proof of biological transmutation occurring. So this is probably the most interesting thing I've seen. I'm gonna see if I can pull up the guy's name here real quick. Let's see. And then the explanation for how this would work, if it does occur per se in the body or in other organisms or anything like that, is actually quite interesting as well. There's some different explanations. There was an old government study on this I found from, I believe it was the 1970s. I don't remember the guy's name. I'm going to see if I can find it. It was the U.S. military. There's a guy named Louis Kevron that did a lot of research on this. That basically his work was kind of popular at the time. It was the early 1970s. So the government did a study on this where they actually looked at the possibility of this occurring, and the conclusion of this study was actually that that it did occur, which is very interesting. The government has actually, like, at least in this published result, said that the biological transmutation does occur. And the guy that did this study, I believe his last name was Goldberg, if I'm recalling correctly, but it might have been something else. It was something like that. He actually posited that ATP may act as a mini cyclotron, which is a particle accelerator, usually on a massive, massive scale. So something that's normally like hundreds and hundreds of feet long, he believed could occur on a microscopic scale where ATP molecules would actually bind to each other using magnesium, and that each ATP magnesium kind of connection would be rotated slightly so the ATP would form a spiral, and that essentially electrons could be conducted across this, or protons could be conducted across this through what's called proton superconduction. And basically this would accelerate protons to the point where they could actually facilitate a nuclear reaction similar to what we see in a particle accelerator. And so he believed anything that produced ATP could produce these mini cyclotrons and actually produce a meaningful change in the consumption, or in the levels of different minerals and elements in the organism. So this is incredibly fascinating to me. There's another explanation that involves the use of background radiation from the sun using what are called neutrinos, which can also facilitate nuclear reactions at room temperatures. But this, like, billions of these pass through our body every second. But when you cross-reference that with the number of cells, it's not that many neutrinos per cell. So the body would have to have some way of concentrating the energy from the neutrinos to carry out these kind of reactions. And then the question becomes, if biological transmutation does occur, is it actually being used for a purpose, or is it just random? But going back to the study I mentioned that I think is the most definitive on this, and there have been some studies that tried to prove this and actually failed or found no effect or no result. So this is by no means settled science, but the study that I referenced earlier, the guy's name was Vladimir Vysotsky, I think is how you say it, Vysotsskii. And he essentially used, the most notable reaction that he found was using bacterial cultures where they introduced barium. And basically they found that it was converted into another element called samarium. And each of these is not found normally in biology. They also had another one where it was cesium, and it converted into barium without them adding any barium, or in the previous example, without having added any samarium. So these are producing novel elements. And interestingly, the difference between barium and samarium is the difference of the same number of protons as in carbon. So it's, if this did occur, it seems to be through the combination of one carbon atom with one barium, which may go against some of the like ATP as a cyclotron explanation. So, who knows if that's the case, or if it's something with neutrinos or something totally different. But with the cesium into barium conversion, that one is only separated by one proton. So that one actually might be something where a proton was introduced into the nucleus. So let's see. Going back to some of the other questions, that's a little bit of a rabbit hole. But as I said, if you guys want to hear like a full lecture on that, I have like a 40 minute lecture that goes over just that on my Patreon called The Alchemy of Life. It's one of the first ones I ever did, so you might have to scroll back a little ways, but incredibly fascinating, and I linked some cool studies on there. Let's see. What health-related rabbit hole are you going down nowadays? So I touched on this briefly, but I've been, like most recently, the last few days, I've been researching herbs for bone regrowth. I'm writing up a little article on this for Patreon as well, where I'm going through some of the different stem cell promoting herbs and things that could potentially help increase the osteoblast differentiation from the stem cells that are used to produce them, known as mesenchymal stem cells. So there's some different herbs like that could potentially be used to increase the healing of small fractures and things like that. And interestingly, stem cell grafts are used medically. So, this stem cell increase is known to increase bone healing, but it's just more of a question of whether you can achieve that using some sort of herbs or supplements or things like that. So my goal is to see if I can achieve something like that. And the reason I'm exploring this currently is because my wife has been dealing a little bit with pain from stress fractures in her feet, and what we believe is also like a microfracture in her knee as well from falling on it. So I'm going to see if I can put something together to help kind of accelerate the healing process, combined with going to the doctor and seeing if there's anything they can do first too. But that's one area I've been looking at. There's been some really interesting herbs I found in that area. Probably the most interesting thing I've learned today was that one of the active compounds in grapefruit and oranges, called naringin, basically is one of the active components in one of the most well-known herbs that actually is known to heal broken or fractured bones, which is called Drinaria fortuna. And basically, Drinaria colloquially is known as the healer of shattered bones. So the main active component, or one of the main active components, is also found in oranges and grapefruit. So it may be that citrus extracts can heal broken bones, or at least kind of promote their healing. I don't know if you could say they would really make too much of a difference, but we'll see. But I'm not sure anyone's ever looked at that. So that's one interesting thing. And then the other thing that I've been looking at is the effects of Nnmt inhibitors, which I mentioned briefly earlier. Here we go. Basically, Nnmt inhibitors, what they do is they actually work by inhibiting the niacinamide, or nicotinamide, sorry, not niacinamide, nicotinamide N-methyltransferase enzyme, which is what Nnmt stands for. So this is basically the enzyme that binds methyl groups to niacin, which is how it's cleared by the body through the liver. So this is a significant source of both niacin metabolism and the depletion of methyl groups from the body. So inhibiting this, which there's some different interesting compounds that could do this. There's the most notable one that I've seen a couple obscure experience reports on is, I believe it's called 5-amino-1-MQ or something like that. There's like two versions of it. One's a quinone, one's a quinolinium. And then there's some other compounds. I'm looking for like an herbal compound that has the same effect, but so far I haven't found any, just because this isn't a very well researched area. But the potential benefits of inhibiting this enzyme are increasing SAMe, the main methyl carrier that I mentioned earlier, increasing NAD+, which is a cofactor in mitochondrial energy metabolism, and upregulating the GLUT4 pathway, which is essentially the main glucose transporter that insulin stimulates to take glucose into cells. So it might improve the usage of glucose, probably lower blood sugar as well. Some of the compounds are being researched as like fat loss drugs, and that's why a lot of the experience reports kind of stem from is people taking them to try and achieve like a performance enhancement or fat loss kind of effect from it. And then it may also increase stem cell activity in certain tissues, potentially muscle tissue or other things like that. It might just generally stimulate the mesenchymal stem cells, which may also be useful for bone healing. And then it could also have some beneficial effects on fat losses, which I kind of touched on. But it could also have negative effects, so it's not all necessarily good. And I'm going to see if I can find like an herb or something that has this activity that's been a little bit more well researched, because the compounds that I found so far are pretty obscure. So that's something else I've been looking at as well, just like the past few days. Do you think it's important to take breaks now and again from the supplements you take? So it depends what it is. I generally just tend to cycle things out, not always like intentionally, but when something runs out, I might kind of not have the money to order it again right away, or I might not think about it for a couple weeks or something. And if it's something really important, I'll notice a difference without it, and I generally will. But with some things, I do kind of just naturally cycle them, like certain herbs or things like that. I will cycle or not really use on a daily basis, just use like them when I feel I could benefit from them the most. So to an extent, I do cycle things, but there's some things that there's no real need or reason to cycle, like magnesium, for example, would be the biggest example. You could take magnesium daily for the rest of your life, and I'd say it would be beneficial. So a lot of supplements you don't really have to, but beyond that, it's up to you, and it's a very case-by-case basis. So not every case you're required to cycle out supplements, and some definitely have more benefit over time. Like certain herbs will have like tonic effects or upregulate different systems or things that take a month or more to take effect. For example, like lion's mane mushroom, it increases some of the different growth factors in the brain, like NGF or nerve growth factor. But at the same time, it also takes a little bit for those changes in the nervous system to actually become noticeable at all. So you really have to work your way up to it a little bit. So a two-part question. One, do you feel resistance training with weights is important for health longevity, or would simply walking be enough? And two, is whey protein a meme or a certified supplement? So first off, I think there's a lot of benefit to weight training that you aren't going to get with like just light cardio. Mainly, I think there's benefit to having more muscle mass. Well, I know there's benefit, like this has been studied. But in my personal experience, especially, I've noticed a lot of benefit just with holding more muscle mass, both like mentally and kind of psychologically as well as physically. It's going to increase your metabolism, like increasing your strength, and muscle mass in general may make you more resistant to injury in some cases. Actually, like putting pressure on your skeletal system will actually strengthen it and increase like bone mineralization and things like that. So you could achieve that. Some of these results, you could achieve with either like running or swimming or lifting weights or any kind of sport. But there's also kind of an element of it where with some of these things, you might want to, so really, I guess what it comes down to, in my opinion, is that you should really stick with what you feel best doing. For me, like for a long time, my family was really into swimming. I was actually like a competitive swimmer for most of my life up until like 16 or 17. And like I was good enough that I made varsity on like the swim team in high school. It was like my main form of physical activity. But the combination of waking up, at like 5 a.m. for practice, jumping into a freezing cold pool, like the chlorine just destroying my skin and hair, and kind of overdoing it on cardio compared to like how much food I was able to eat. So I wasn't able to gain weight because I'm already someone with a high metabolism. It was very difficult for me burning that much calories to eat enough to maintain weight. So I would actually lose weight very easily. And I was just constantly very low body fat. And I plateaued as far as my progress with the sport pretty quickly as a result of that after I, reached full, I guess, like maturity and everything like that. And I think it impacted my hormones as well, just like not getting enough sleep and like overexerting myself like that. So, for me, that was something that I couldn't keep up with. I ended up like having to quit just for my own sake. And basically, going back to it now, I think I'd probably enjoy it more if I was smarter about it. But, someone that can't really run without being completely uncomfortable or something like that, resistance training or weight training might make the difference between them exercising on a daily basis and them not ever exercising in any form. If running does the same thing for you, though, I think it's just as beneficial from like a health and longevity perspective. So it kind of just depends. I think that bare minimum from like general health perspective, 30 minutes of moderate exercise per day should be what you try and shoot for. But if you can get above that, that's where you really start to see the benefits. And then whey protein. So whey protein is really like one of the most established supplements that's known to promote muscle growth, mostly just because it's adding an extra protein source. Someone that takes however much whey protein is going to have better results than someone who doesn't. It's not necessarily like a superior protein source in general. It may have a little bit higher concentration of something like the amino acid leucine, which may be slightly more anabolic, but it's not necessarily going to make or break anything. If you compare like someone who's achieving the same protein intake without whey protein with someone who is, I don't think there's any added benefit to that. And a lot of whey protein supplements are just complete garbage. Like there's no benefit to them, and it can cause maybe even negative effects like gut issues or bloating or things like that if it's got a bunch of carbs or fillers or things like that. And if you're trying to lose weight while maintaining muscle, you might want to go with something that doesn't have any added sugar or carbs either. So, definitely assess your goals and go from there with it. Recommended vaccine detox. So this isn't one that I can really discuss. I'm not comfortable speaking on the vaccine publicly. It's just too controversial of an issue. What do you think about Dr. Kat's niacin and melatonin protocol? So I am very happy that he added melatonin recently. As you guys know, I've been promoting melatonin for a long time. And, basically like his addition of melatonin that's based on a lot of good research, most notably by Doris Loh, L-O-H is how you spell her last name, who devised the original like melatonin protocol for COVID she also used a combination of melatonin and vitamin C, which in my opinion is probably one of the better protocols for COVID, just based on a mechanistic perspective. I'm a little bit skeptical to jump right into saying like a protocol works when we don't have RCT data. Now it's possible, some people will say like, oh, if something doesn't pan out in like a clinical trial, that's because it's being suppressed by the pharmaceutical companies. And that's possible, but usually it goes the other way. Usually you see like if someone pays thousands and thousands of dollars to have a clinical trial done, they're not going to want to do one just for like a bad result. And really like some of these things could pan out realistically. It's just going to be like a question of whether like the studies are done anytime soon. So, there's so many different supplements that are being hailed as like a cure for COVID or treatment for COVID or all this different stuff. So I'm skeptical to say anything is going to be like the supplement that's going to make all the difference in the world. Like a combination of multiple that have preliminary data showing they're effective is probably the best you're going to get right now. And when it comes to Dr. Katz, I like the fact that he's included melatonin because I think it's very promising. His research on niacin may be promising as well. I don't know if I agree with his mechanistic interpretation of that. I think that it might work through a different, probably simpler kind of pathway, like just increasing NAD plus, which niacin supplementation is known to do. And if that's the case, he could probably get away with a lower dose. And I believe he has reduced the dose recently in his protocol. I think multiple people told him that it was overkill, or he had like some people getting side effects or something like that. I'm not sure. I haven't really spoken to him, but I think that if you do use niacin, first off, you need to be aware of the potential for methylation issues. You also need to be aware that the research on heart disease with niacin has not panned out, so it doesn't reduce the risk of heart disease, but it doesn't increase it either. It's kind of a net neutral effect as far as the combination of all the studies on it have shown. And then when it comes to the combination of niacin and melatonin, I think that you might get more benefit overall using something like red light as well. Probably other nutrients too. Things like thiamine also show a lot of promise. Vitamin C, as I mentioned. So I think his protocol probably works for some. I'm sure he's gotten a lot of good results. I don't know if it's more from the niacin or the melatonin. I suspect the melatonin might play a bigger role. And I don't think that at this point we can say for sure that anything is like a cure or a viable treatment. We need more studies than just like the one or the case studies that he uses to support his stuff. But it's promising, and if it helps someone, that's awesome. Let's see. Can being outside in the sun raise blood sugar? I don't believe so. I haven't seen any reason to suspect this. I think it may lower blood sugar, but more so in a general sense of reducing the risk of insulin resistance and obesity and things like that increase your risk of high blood sugar. So if anything, I would assume it would be the opposite. But I don't know if anyone's done like a continuous glucose monitoring where they tested like days where they went out in the sun and didn't. If someone did, that would be interesting, but it's all anecdotal. Let's see. Saw your physique update on Twitter. Is there something specific you do for bulking, or do you just eat to satiety? So I've been tracking my nutrition, which has gotten me the best results when I can keep up with it. Basically, with like trying to put on muscle, the main things you want to focus on, just in a very simple sense, are getting 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. You can do more. Some people say that like more is better in that sense, like 1.5 or something would be better. It's like, I'm not really sure if that's going to be enough that you really see a huge difference or not. So I just stick with about a gram, a little bit more. I think I weigh like 175 at this point. I eat about 200 grams of protein. So, that's what I've been shooting for. I've also been, usually getting between like 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day, I believe, like 3,500. Some days definitely cannot get enough into where I'm like, where I don't believe I've hit my caloric intake, or I know for a fact I haven't. And it's just like some days I get busy or have consults or something, or, I just need to go to the grocery store and I don't have the food around the house that I need to do that, just because it's a little bit more to keep up with when you're trying to gain weight. But really just like keeping yourself in a caloric surplus and getting that protein goal is going to be the main thing that you have to do, really. And most people, they just aren't aware of their caloric intake, or they're not hitting it right. So what I use for that is the app called Chronometer, which in my opinion is probably the best nutrition tracking app available. I have yet to see anything better. So that's, don't consider it like a black and white thing where it's like, oh, you're getting exactly this many calories. It's give or take a few hundred calories. So, if you keep that in mind, I think it can be a very useful tool for actually figuring out how much caloric intake you're getting and adjusting that as needed. You might not see results at 3,000 calories per day. If that's the case and you've been trying it for a couple of weeks, maybe you can bump it up to 500. Or if you start to notice yourself gaining weight when you're up to like 4,000 or something, you can drop it back down. Everybody's going to have a different metabolic rate. Different things can affect it, like how much sunlight exposure you get, your sleep at night, all these different things. So, it's going to vary per person, but keeping a caloric surplus, at least by a few hundred calories to start off with, and getting enough protein per day is going to be kind of a simple starting point. Let's see. I've been eating clean about 95%, more than 95% of the time for the past 6 months, but I get drastic skin dryness, such rough texture whenever I take the extra step of switching to carnivore diet. Any idea why? Let's see. I believe it's lack of vitamin C, or possibly also it could be lack of retinol. Not 100% sure on that. There could be other factors too, but that would be my guess. It could also be your hormones taking a hit. Like your androgen levels are going to affect your the amount of oil secreted by the skin. So you're going to have like more acne when your androgens are higher, like puberty and things like that, versus when they're lower. And in some cases, when it comes to like a low carb diet or something like that, some people have a very strong increase in which essentially, is going to boost the testosterone level. Whether that's meaningful or not, whether it's the issue in this case, who knows? You'd have to get blood work and everything to confirm that, or experiment for yourself with different things. But really, I'm not a fan of the carnivore diet overall. I think you can do an elimination diet, but some of the things that really, like most of the things that really matter when it comes to the elimination diet are still eliminated with an omnivore diet. Like you can cut out the processed grains, all the like junk food and things like that, fried foods and oils, not oils themselves, but like the oxidized oils that are used in kind of heavily fried food, like you see at a lot of fast food restaurants. Some people, grains are an issue. Some people, dairy is an issue. But you can cut out all of those things and still have an omnivore diet. Really, like there's always going to be something that you can have that's going to be tolerable for you. Even if you have like a dozen food sensitivities, you will always be able to include at least like some plants and some animal products, unless you've gotten yourself so used to like a level of inflammation that you have with like a total elimination diet. Like I've seen a couple cases where people almost like get stuck on the carnivore diet, where they'll eat it for a long time and then their body becomes like hypersensitive to different antigens, like a inflammatory stimulus that they get from like a plant or something like that, which normally the body has become kind of acclimated to a certain level of intake of that. But when you go completely without it for long enough, then you will have like a negative reaction to really like anything you reintroduce outside of the elimination diet. So, that's like one kind of example I've seen where it's actually even like a negative effect. But for the most part, I think it's a little bit unnecessary, and you can achieve the same results with like other dietary adjustments. Like if it's an inflammation thing, the real inflammatory foods are going to be like processed sugar, the fried food, the like some cases grains or dairy or things like that. So like figuring out what's really the issue for you. You can go with it kind of broad spectrum elimination diet and then work backwards from there and reintroduce things one at a time. Like you can cut out dairy, grains, like beans, nuts, everything like that. Like most plant oils, or at least like fried foods for sure, restaurant food, sugar, processed sugar. And then you can introduce like one or two of those things at a time, like dairy back in after a few months. And then you can see how you respond to that one thing at a time. Do it for like the first meal of the day. And that's a much better way, in my opinion, to do an elimination diet. Let's see. I am in an extremely rural locale. Spotty connectivity for lives here. Oh, okay. Hoping this will be available to replay, but I'm so glad you are here, still watching now. Awesome. Well, happy you're here. And I mentioned this earlier, but I think I can put this back up after the fact, hopefully. I believe it'll still be up on YouTube after for people to rewatch, but not 100% sure on that. I haven't done one of these through YouTube before. Usually I do them through Patreon using another like service or website called Crowdcast, which does have the replays on there too. So I have some old Q&As on there, but for this one, I'll have to figure it out after we're done here. Do you supplement with exogenous or with endogenous melatonin? I assume you mean exogenous, but I'm not sure. But I have been experimenting with it recently, actually, basically to see if there's any noticeable benefit between that and red light. So I'm currently doing the exogenous melatonin, and then when I run out of the bottle that I have, I'm going to try red light before bed instead, I think. So currently I am. In general, my goal is to see if there's like more noticeable benefit or a better benefit just from proper circadian rhythm regulation. But as we were kind of talking about earlier with like the niacin melatonin protocol, I think there is benefit to melatonin supplements in some cases. Now, with red light, for example, or with infrared light, you're going to get melatonin production increase in essentially every cell in the body. So, in my opinion, that's going to be a more noticeable effect than necessarily than a supplement. You might penetrate most of the cells in the body, but um, essentially, I think there's going to be a lot more interesting benefit with the red light, just from the perspective of like not just melatonin too, but other things being created in the cells, like other antioxidant enzymes, like superoxide dismutase, just general mitochondrial function stimulation, different things like that. Let's see. What are your opinions on the subject of eyeglasses and sunlight? Do I need to leave my glasses at home to get the full benefits of sunlight on my early morning walk? So I've discussed this a little bit in the past, but basically glass, like typical glass, filters out. Um, so your standard glass, unfortunately, is very molecularly disorganized. So it filters out a good percentage of the light spectrum. Most notably, it filters out UVB light, infrared light, and it predisposes the light spectrum more towards blue light. So even if you're indoors, like sitting next to a window, the sunlight you get through it is going to be less bright. You're not going to be able to make vitamin D from it. You're not getting the benefits of infrared light for the most part. And basically, you're actually going to have more actually of I guess you could say like negative effect from it, in the sense that it's going to be more blue light predisposed than normal. So basically what I would say is the best way to manage this outside. Now, with glasses like this, it's not as big of an issue because you're going to get some light from around them. But one of my favorite things to do is like, going outside and sunbathing and taking off your glasses for a bit. And essentially, just like, it depends how well you can see without them. Like if it's like you can't see at all, obviously don't like walk around outside and hurt yourself or something. Like don't walk in front of a car without them. But if you can take them off for some of the time you're outside, I think there's benefit to it. I feel better with it. I notice almost like a pretty fast like relaxation effect when I take them off for a bit. And it seems to stem from the different parts of the light spectrum hitting the eye. What a lot of people don't know is that actually some of the different neurotransmitters like dopamine are actually produced in the eye by the light, different parts of the light spectrum hitting it. So dopamine synthesis and the neurons that contain dopamine receptors can be upregulated by different growth factors that are known to be stimulated by UV and other parts of the light spectrum. So there's some really cool stuff there. And essentially, this can cause like pretty interesting psychological effects. UV light also stimulates the production of a precursor protein called POMC, which then differentiates down into endorphins, among other things. So you also have an increase in endorphin activity, and you're going to get some of that from it hitting the skin. All of these different neurotransmitters and things can be stimulated through sunlight hitting the skin too. But when it comes to the eyes, it's going to be a more potent effect because they're actually an extension of the nervous system that can produce those same neurotransmitters and things themselves. So there's some really interesting stuff when it comes to the actual effects of light in the eye. So this is like some of the stuff where people talk about like the benefits of sun gazing. Let's see. Is having a regular wake up and bedtime important circadian rhythm wise? Is there an optimal day for each? I assume you mean time. I've heard that 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. are the most important hours for sleep. Can't remember the source. So this depends a little bit, but basically my philosophy on this is if you can get as close to actually so my kind of goal is to fall asleep as close to after the time the sun sets as possible and wake up as close to sunrise as possible. Now, depending on the time of the year, depending on where you live, all this different stuff, that window will be a little bit smaller or larger, and it really is going to be dependent a little bit too on how much sleep you need. Ideally, you're going to be able to sleep as long as you need to feel rested. Like, an alarm clock, for example, is going to disrupt your sleep kind of inherently just because you haven't completed a full sleep cycle. But like if you cover your windows with like curtains or something and you don't get the light waking up in the morning, you could also potentially just like have your sleep cycle extended beyond the point that you really like want to be able to sleep or something like that. Like you might go 12 hours when you don't need that much inherently. So there's some ways around this, but really it's a little bit difficult when you're inside, just because, as we kind of talked about earlier, like even when you have the window open, it's not going to give you a ton of light, but you can kind of get around this. But like if you've ever gone camping and slept in a tent outside where you get most of the sunlight and everything through the window, it's impossible to sleep past like, 8 or something, because the light becomes so bright just from you being even just close to outside that that it's almost like a natural alarm clock. And if you get on a sleep cycle like that, where you get bright light first thing in the morning, it becomes very easy for you to fall asleep fairly early as well. So the biggest thing is like, you don't want to get a bunch of artificial light at night, because it's going to stimulate all of these signals that tell your brain essentially that it's closer to the middle of the day, because that's when you see the highest percentage of the blue light, which is also high in artificial light. So you're going to get things like increased glutamate signaling through what's called the SCN, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's one of the main control centers for the circadian rhythm. And this causes the actual circadian rhythm to be shifted forward. So when you do try and fall asleep, it's more difficult. The other things you want to be aware of is eating before bed can cause issues with circadian rhythm, because having an insulin spike will actually inhibit your melatonin release. Though eating a few hours, like 3 or 4 hours before bed, can even maybe be a little bit beneficial, because insulin will help some of the different proteins and amino acids, I should say, get into the brain more easily, like tryptophan, which is then converted into melatonin. So there's a lot of benefit to that. There's some pretty cool effects when you balance that out, and you can really get the most out of both like your last meal of the day from like a nutritional standpoint and sleeping and everything. So really there's no set time for everyone, but 10 p.m. to, I guess like more like 6, 7, 8 a.m. Would be probably the best. I would say 10 p.m. is a pretty good bedtime. If it gets dark earlier, you can go to bed earlier. Just don't put on a bunch of bright light as soon as the sun goes down, because you're totally flipping your circadian rhythm, because it's even dimmer during the day when you have the windows open than when you turn on the artificial lights at night. You can get around this by getting the bright light, getting outside during the day. Bright light first thing in the morning is one of the most important and kind of under discussed things when it comes to circadian rhythm management. And then you can also essentially use, kind of on the flip side, blue light filtered light bulbs, basically to limit the amount of the blue light that you're getting at night. So that can also help. Is your long hair just for aesthetic purposes or for getting sixth sense powers? So I've seen some of the like reports on that stuff where like people have different telekinetic powers or whatever, when I guess it wouldn't be telekinesis. I'm not sure what telepathy or like different things like that. I'm not sure if it's legit. I haven't really felt any different with short or long hair personally. In some sense, it's a little bit annoying just because like I'm a little bit predisposed to like hyperstimulation or things like that with the autism. But basically, I do feel I look better with it. So in some ways, I guess it is mostly for aesthetic purposes. But at the same time, too, I feel there's also at least some other benefit to having longer hair as compared to like maybe shaving your head or something. But I have no idea if it's psychological or not. Let's see. Gonna list my favorite testosterone hacks and see what you would add to it. Obviously, you have sunlight, circadian rhythm, and eating a lot of high quality macros and micros. Boron, long jack, ginseng, ashwagandha, maca, supplemental zinc, and MK7. Okay, so let's see. Maca is the one that stands out to me as not increasing testosterone. There's a little bit of misconception around this, where it actually, like a lot of people think it does. It's included in those like gas station erection pills or whatever and things like that. But like it's not actually useful for increasing testosterone itself. Now, whether that matters, it's like probably not. It has other benefits for sure. But that's one that I wouldn't say is very potent in increasing testosterone, or it doesn't increase testosterone in any meaningful way, if it does at all. Ginseng is also not that potent in that sense, but it has a ton of other benefits as well. Probably the best, or one of the best herbs for neurogenesis, which is fantastic. Let's see. So other things that I like and have been using, the ingredients in my like Vitality tonic blend that I put together, some of those are really fantastic. Like most notably, the one that I don't see here is Sustanch, which is really fantastic. I would have included Long Jack, but it tastes terrible. So that's one that I didn't end up using, partially for that reason. Let's see if there's anything I'm forgetting. Some of the others, like Sustanch, is really surprisingly potent. Like I even get a little bit of like aggressiveness or irritability if I use like too much of a potent extract of it. Some other things like Safed muesli is another one that I feel a lot from, though I don't know if it's like testosterone boosting effect. Like both that and Sustanch aren't really that well researched or researched at all in humans. So it has like theoretical testosterone increasing effects, but it's difficult to say if it's actually doing that in the body. As far as like other nutrients go, magnesium is obviously one of the most important. Vitamin D, but you can get that from the sun. There's a axis, basically what I call the holy trinity of fat soluble vitamins, which is vitamin K2, retinol, right, or vitamin A, and vitamin D. So those three together, there's some studies showing basically that if you only have even just two out of those three in like adequate levels, then basically you are only going to be able to produce a certain amount of like the different androgens and things like that, or some of the pathways involved are going to be impaired. Chris Masterjohn has a really interesting lecture on this that where he goes through some of the data. It's like in boys going through puberty, they're more likely to be deficient in one of those three nutrients if they are if their hormones are disrupted or things like that. Let's see. Any concerns around exogenous melatonin being endocrine disruptive? So I have researched this to death. I have gone through every study I could find originally because I found some data, like cell data, showing melatonin acts as an aromatase inhibitor. So I was interested if it notably increased testosterone. And then after that, because I found some different stuff where people were saying that melatonin either has antigonadal effects where it like suppresses the testes production of different hormones, or it disrupts puberty, or just different things like that. Or also there's been some question about whether it causes a reduction in endogenous production of melatonin when you supplement it exogenously. So the conclusion that I found, research, like looking at every study I could find on this, that looked at the effect of melatonin on the major hormones, including LH, FSH, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, all of these, as well as the effects of melatonin on melatonin levels in the body and puberty. So the effects of melatonin on the actual like hormones themselves, I found one study that showed it increases LH slightly, which would theoretically increase testosterone and to a lesser extent estrogen, depending on whether you're a man or a woman, in the testes or the ovaries. But at the same time, pretty much every other study I found showed that it didn't have any effect on this. I think locally it acts as an aromatase inhibitor, so there might be some slight difference there, but it's not enough to noticeably really increase testosterone and like fatty tissue or things like that. It doesn't really increase estrogen either. Really, like on the general hormone axis, even when monitored across like a 24-hour plus period after taking it, it doesn't change the hormone balance at all on average between like two groups of people. One takes it, one doesn't. And that's across a lot of studies. There isn't really any good data showing the disruption of the hormone system or even any positive effects on other hormones with melatonin. Now, I think that if you were to block melatonin, you might see some effects. But this is just more theoretical, and it's difficult to really test that. But if you have like your baseline level of melatonin versus a higher above baseline level, it doesn't seem to increase it much. I think that the effect on like the aromatase inhibition or LH or FSH or something like that might become apparent if you were to somehow block melatonin synthesis. But whether that's actually like a feasible thing where you could study it or whether it's been studied and I'm not aware of it, I'm not sure. As far as melatonin affecting melatonin production, that doesn't seem to be the case either. Originally, I was concerned about this too, but I didn't see any evidence of that being the case. As far as the melatonin affecting melatonin production on a cellular level, this was something else I looked at because it's not just produced in the brain. Every cell in the body technically can produce melatonin as an antioxidant. Interestingly, I found that when you look at the pathways here, the researcher Doris Lowe that I mentioned earlier actually pointed this out to me via Twitter conversation. Melatonin actually might stimulate the production of melatonin on a cellular level when it's released into the bloodstream. So there may even be a circadian rhythm of melatonin levels within your cells where it goes higher when there's infrared light exposed to it, and when it goes higher at night when melatonin levels are higher in the bloodstream. So there may even be an increase in melatonin production in response to supplemental melatonin, not a decrease. There's not really any evidence I've seen of a decrease. People seem to acclimate to its effects after a while. Like if you take melatonin supplements, you might not notice much benefit after like a year, but also like who's going to remember what their sleep was like subjectively a year ago even if they've been supplementing melatonin for that long. So I'm skeptical even that is like a result of any kind of tolerance to it. And then let's see, the last thing. So people say it's like it disrupts puberty or it's like anti-gonadal or things like that. As I said, in adults across all kinds of different age groups, it doesn't really affect the hormones in much of a meaningful way, really at all. There's like, if you look at all the data combined, there was a couple outlier studies, but nothing really that shows altered hormone balance. And originally they thought in puberty that it might disrupt hormone balance, but it's based on very low quality or speculative data. And when they've actually studied it more in depth, it hasn't panned out. There's like one or two studies that people like cherry pick that show or that theorize different effects or show it based on some anecdotes or something, but there's no real good data showing consistent disruption of puberty or development during childhood or things like that. People have been giving melatonin to their kids for so long that it would be a very widespread issue if it caused more significant issues like that. The only other data I've seen people use to justify melatonin as like a hormone disruptor is basically that it might cause like an issue with puberty or that it might suppress the gonadal like androgen production or things like that. The people base it on rodent data, which is really like not a viable comparison because rodents have a like kind of yearly circadian rhythm with melatonin as well as like a daily. So with rodents, they actually have a hibernation period. And when we look at mice or something like that, during their hibernation period, when it's very dark and their melatonin is high, they are going to have genetically kind of predisposed lower libido. So they have a different response to melatonin than like other mammals do in general that don't hibernate, because melatonin for them is essential for them to not increase their metabolism and energy usage through kind of this period of time where they should be conserving energy as much as possible by having a raging libido or higher androgen levels, which would also increase their metabolism. So this doesn't carry over to humans. People say like this, people have some leftover genetics for hibernation, but I haven't really seen any good example of this. So I'm skeptical it occurs at all. And then we know for a fact it doesn't affect it from a hormonal perspective. So let's see. Speaking of melatonin, what's your opinion on Dimitri's protocol of niacin plus melatonin? I already answered this a bit earlier, but I'll like summarize my answer again in case you weren't here for that. Basically, so I'm glad he added melatonin. I believe it's one of the more effective potential treatments for COVID or potential adjuvants or whatever you want to call it. Now, a lot of the nutrient therapies and things haven't really panned out, like vitamin D supplementation, for example, doesn't, the RCTs that have been done on it haven't really shown really impressive results. same as a lot of the drugs that everyone was originally like going on and on about, like hydroxychloroquine and things like that. Like they're decent, but they don't really show like a ton of like super promising data as like a treatment. So I don't think it's a good idea to jump the gun and say something's a cure or a viable treatment or something like that based on even just like one or two positive RCTs or anecdotes or things like that. It like any of these nutrients are going to be helpful if someone's deficient in them, or in general, some of them have like more broad metabolic beneficial effects. Like niacin, I think the mechanism by which it works, if it does work in this case, which, he's got some promising anecdotes and stuff behind his work, but so do a ton of other things. So whether it's like the best option per se is hard to say. I think he's definitely passionate about it, but I don't know if that's going to help or hurt his case. But basically, I think if niacin works, the most likely mechanism is probably through NAD plus increase. He has some other mechanism that he talks about as well. I believe it's NAADP that he believes in increases. I haven't seen any evidence of that even existing in humans. Maybe there's some that I haven't seen, but whether that actually is the mechanism or not, I think it's probably more likely NAD plus or just some general effect on mitochondrial energy metabolism. There are some concerns that I have with this protocol, most notably that last I saw, at least, he doesn't really address the potential interactions of niacin, especially in high doses with methylation. People that are undermethylated could have a very negative reaction to niacin as a result of it binding to methyl groups in the liver and depleting them. So there could potentially be issues with that causing essentially just like different problems with niacin triggering worsened undermethylation or exacerbating different symptoms like ruminating thoughts or OCD tendencies or things like that. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. Melatonin on its own might be just as effective or close to just as effective. And there's other things that I think he could and maybe should add, like vitamin C has some interesting data on it. Doris Lowe proposed a protocol of melatonin and vitamin C like last year around like the beginning of 2020 when this first started becoming an issue, and her research on that is pretty fantastic. At the very least, I think melatonin is probably beneficial based on her work on that, but you can read more about that and decide for yourself. And then I think there's some promising data on thiamine as well, though it hasn't been tested as well. Similar to niacin, like both of those have not been well researched, so it's hard to say for sure how that's going to carry over. Let's see. Is there a norepinephrine component to ADHD-like symptoms, more specifically motivation to start and execute work, aka actual action rather than concentration once started? So this is actually pretty interesting. There's a pretty high tendency in ADHD individuals for them to have a skewed copper to zinc ratio. So what this means is that when you look at their blood work, they have copper at the high end of the normal range or outside the normal range, whereas zinc is the low end of the normal range or deficient. And really, you want the two close to a 1-to-1 ratio, within 10 or 20 points of a 1-to-1 ratio. And basically, when your zinc is depleted and copper is high, copper acts as a cofactor for the enzyme that converts dopamine into norepinephrine and then norepinephrine into epinephrine, which is adrenaline. So the enzyme pathway is like that converts one into the other is activated by too much copper and zinc deficiency. So zinc deficiency has been shown to occur in about 75% roughly of people with ADHD. And as a result, I think a lot of them have a predisposition actually towards more norepinephrine and adrenaline. And this is seen more commonly based on a lot of case studies and things like that in individuals with essentially more of the hyperactive predisposition. So it's possible that low dopamine and high adrenaline or high noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine, can actually are actually like part of the phenotype of like the true ADHD versus the ADD, which might just have low dopamine and low adrenaline. So really how that manifests is going to vary a bit by person to person, but I think you might have more action or activity. It might just be harder to do like kind of what you're talking about, like work or things that you have to do to be responsible or things like that, even if you're like a very active or very excitable person. So balancing the zinc to copper ratio and then essentially getting the dopamine function, everything back up through things like improving methylation. Sometimes you also see B6 deficiency combined with it. Blood blood sugar imbalances and things like that are actually fairly common. Blue light can also cause issues, or it's linked to issues according to some studies. So there's some interesting other factors as well, but that's one of the main ones, I think. Let's see. Do you believe there's any added benefit in consuming the foods your parents/grandparents used to eat in great quantities, traditional food, for example? So, yeah, honestly, I would say there probably is some benefit to traditional foods just because it has some characteristics that are going to be more beneficial. So, for example, they're less likely to use a lot of like sugar and a lot of the time they might have better processing of things like grains to allow them to be more nutritious. For example, like soaking oats or something like that, or lightly fermenting them versus just doing like instant oats or something like that. There's all these different kind of divergences. Depends where your like traditional food lineage, I guess you could say, comes from. But in some parts of the world, you see a very potent benefit to longevity with like kind of traditional eating patterns in certain areas. Like the best example of this that everybody talks about is like the Mediterranean diet, which really, in my opinion, comes down to a couple things. But one of the things that you see is they forage a lot for their food in areas that are considered like blue zones, which there's a lot of factors. It's not all dietary, but they forage a lot. So you get a lot of like different phytonutrients and almost like herbal medicine type foods in the form of like your nutrition. And a lot of traditional cultures, you see this as an incorporation of into their diet is like foraging and actually knowing the local foods and things like that. You'll see sometimes like alcohol consumption will be kind of modeled in a more beneficial way, where it's not like cheap, low quality wine. It might have a lot more flavonoids and things, and it's more moderated in some cases, not all. You might see a lot more sunlight exposure. Most blue zones are near the equator, at least somewhere where they're getting sunlight pretty much year round. Usually a lot more seafood consumption. You might see more consumption of certain like oils and things that are known to be healthy, like olive oil or coconut oil over animal fat. You might see lower amounts of like red meat in favor of other things that are lower in iron. So there's a lot of benefit to some different traditional dietary patterns. It's more just a matter of like finding what's really beneficial about it and incorporating that into your life from there. Let's see. When I eat outside, I always get diarrhea. I take fiber powder, zinc, digest enzymes, apple cider, which could reduce it, but I have to be very careful about the food. I always cook by myself. Not sure that's a question, but yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. If you are still here, if you could specify like what your question is specifically, I think that might be a little bit easier for me to answer. Is fluorescent blue light filtered light bulbs? So fluorescent light bulbs are not blue light filtered, but you can get blue light filtered fluorescent bulbs. If you search like blue light filtered bulbs on Amazon, seems to be the best selection in like kind of a general platform sense. I couldn't really find any on eBay, but I tried some different ones on Amazon. Let's see, I might be able to find the brand I use. There's been a couple I've tried. Some of them are better than others. The main problems I had with some of them were that they ended up being really orange or yellow. Now, without the actual ability to analyze the light itself, like the spectrum and everything like that, then it's going to be a bit more difficult to really tell like how it's going to look and everything. But what I found personally was that the Miracle LED brand worked best in a kind of a general sense. It looks fairly close to like an incandescent light spectrum. It's not going to have the infrared light, but it's also not going to jack up your electricity bill at all. I also tried the KINUR brand, and they were terrible in the sense that they were very, very yellow. So it completely distorted the kind of color spectrum. And I'm probably going to switch the ones I have out with the Miracle LED brand again. There might be some better ones. I believe that's all the ones I've tried. I also got some Edison bulbs that are like the amber ones that are like incandescent bulbs for parts of the house where I couldn't find any actual bulbs that fit the outlet, essentially. So, not every outlet is going to be the right size for an incandescent bulb. But would incandescent be greater than Miracle LED? So we don't have data on this, actually. There's essentially, with the fluorescent and LED bulbs, like the ones that aren't altered in any way, they are going to be basically, they're going to be a little bit so they're going to block about like 80% roughly, maybe higher in some cases, of your melatonin production based on the best estimates and data we have on this. And then the incandescent bulbs, it's about half as much, at about like 40%. Now, we don't know how much the blue light filtered bulbs are going to block when it comes to melatonin production. Some, like even just a bright light in general, is going to block some amount. But if you compare like the incandescent bulb that blocks 40% of your melatonin to firelight, which only blocks like 2%, that's a pretty big difference. And you could potentially achieve that with like a really, really good blue light filtered bulb. So I'd say the blue light filtered bulbs might be a little bit better in that sense, at least. So that's something to be aware of. But incandescent bulbs, like if your choice is between incandescent bulbs and the like other types of light bulbs or things like that, like if it's between incandescent bulbs and like fluorescent, then incandescent's better by a mile. Let's see. All right. I've been allergic to eggs since childhood. Any way to reverse this? Just do the yolks. The egg whites are usually what's responsible for the sensitivity. I'm not sure if there is a way to reverse this. There's like some protocols, like the GAPS protocol, which is like a microbiome gut function kind of reset protocol, so to speak. It uses a gradual approach where initially they cut out a lot of foods that people are sensitive to, including egg whites, and then they introduce it back first with like raw egg yolks, and then with the I believe cooked egg whites are a little bit better in that sense, because some of the proteins that are responsible for the sensitivity are broken down. But it kind of varies a bit by person. But you can experiment with some different things like that, like the raw egg yolks on their own might be better. If you can't eat them and you've tried everything and there's no way around it, then it's not too much of a loss. You can replace the same nutrient content. Eggs are great, but like it's not the end of the world if you can't eat them. You could try other types of eggs too, like duck eggs or something like that, if you can find them. I don't know if the protein content that's responsible for the sensitivity would be the same, but it's worth a shot if that's something that you're interested in here. All right, let's see. Appreciate you taking the time to do this. Are there any specific seafoods you recommend? So I mentioned this briefly earlier, but if you go on so you can search on Google FDA mercury in fish and shellfish, and there's a link that comes up where basically they have organized up to like the data from like 2012 or something. They've organized all the seafood from highest to lowest mercury content. So they organize it by parts per million, or ppm mercury. My recommendation on a like weekly basis for things to consume regularly is anything below 0.1 parts per million mercury, which leaves you with most types of shellfish. I think lobster and crab might be slightly higher, but like shrimp is lower. There's some other ones like salmon, sardines, some types of mackerel, some freshwater fish like catfish. Some of these are lower too. And then you also see pretty much all shellfish are going to be lower than that, as well as octopus, interestingly too. So basically, those would be my main recommendations. Like I pretty much stick to like shellfish, salmon, and occasionally other types of fish. Salmon roe or other types of like fish eggs are also extremely nutritious, so you can try that too, but it's really up to you. Just find some that taste good, really, and eat as much of it as you can. I would do at least like half of my seafood consumption from shellfish though, just because it's so low in mercury that you can literally eat like 8 or 10 pounds of it in a week without getting anywhere close to the mercury limit for like most healthy adults. Let's see. My thoughts on inositol. So inositol is generally beneficial. The only case where I would say it's not, or where there might be problems with it, is I've seen some bipolar people where it can induce mania, like even in tiny, tiny amounts. So if you're diagnosed bipolar, I would avoid it. Usually you'll know if it's like a problem for you though. And then overmethylated people, which is actually very common in bipolar, then you can also see an issue with it. And that's because one of its main actions is increasing serotonin receptor activity or sensitivity. It's not really clear whether it's like the upregulating the receptors or whether it enhances the like effectiveness of the downstream effects after the receptor or what, but basically inositol seems to be effective at increasing the serotonin signaling, so it can reduce ruminating thoughts and things like that quite effectively. It's actually shown good results in studies on it as a treatment for OCD, for example. So there's some interesting stuff like that. And I'd say for most people, it's going to be beneficial or neutral. So in general, it's probably very beneficial, and certainly it's better than like pure sugar, for example. You can use it in place of sugar. It's about half as sweet as sugar, so you can just swap it out in like a recipe. Just make sure you like double the concentration when you switch to inositol. Let's see. I have a friend that used to drink cow milk that went full vegan for some months and now is allergic to dairy. Is there a way to reverse this? Would it even be advisable to do so? So I would start very small with the dairy intake. I have some clients that are lactose intolerant and they can still tolerate. So I would start with kefir because it's generally the least inflammatory form of dairy. It's such a potent probiotic that you're going to get benefit from it even if you don't necessarily consume like a full cup or something of it. Even like a teaspoon of kefir would be equivalent to like a probiotic supplement, or even better than most you'd find at the store. So I'd start with like a tablespoon of kefir once in the morning and once in the evening, and assuming they can tolerate that, then you can go from there and basically work your way up gradually as high as you can. Bare minimum, a tablespoon of kefir per day is going to be extremely beneficial, and that's going to give you a lot of benefit to that. And kefir, there's some studies showing, some of it based on like mechanism interpretation, but some of it based on actual results, that it can reduce gut inflammation and maybe even reverse sensitivity to different foods. Look up the effects of haptens, Haptens, and there's some cool data on that and some different herbs and things that might affect that too. Astragalus is another one that might reduce hapten formation, which is responsible for a lot of food sensitivities. So those two, for example, I've seen it reverse. I've seen that combination of like astragalus and ample kefir reverse different food sensitivities for clients before, but bare minimum, you'll get benefit from the kefir either way. Let's see. What are your thoughts on dental health? Brushing twice a day with conventional toothpaste clearly doesn't eliminate all cavities. Number one thing is literally just removing sugar intake. Like, main effect that causes cavities is the metabolism of sugars through bacteria in the mouth into different acids that basically will eat away at the teeth. And when the pH of the mouth gets high enough, or sorry, low enough, it's more acidic, it's lower, but when the pH gets acidic enough in the mouth, basically it causes the calcium crystals that make up the teeth and the enamel to start to dissolve. So that's what weakens certain areas in the teeth, and especially it's areas where like you have bacterial growth that you aren't able to clear properly. All fluoride really does is it replaces the calcium crystals with a different type of calcium crystals, which are fluoridated calcium crystals. It's the standard crystals surrounding the teeth that make up the teeth enamel is called hydroxyapatite. And then the fluoride binds with it and converts it into fluoroapatite. And essentially that's more stable in response to the acidity. But if you just remove the acidity itself, you'll see a far greater effect. The traditional people groups that don't have any cavities, according to the research of like Weston A. Price, for example, essentially the thing they have in common is they don't consume sugar, and they consume plenty of different antibacterial herbs and things that they forage. So reducing the bacterial concentration in the mouth might be helpful. Some people also use like tooth powder or toothpaste or things like that actually contain apatite, so it can remineralize the teeth potentially. I don't know if it really works that well. I'd have to look into it a lot further to really say for sure. But the main thing is going to be reducing sugar, and maybe you could do something like oil pulling with like an antibacterial oil like coconut oil or black seed oil, or a combination of the two, that might have some activity against the bacteria that cause the cavities in the first place as well. What are some mainstream health assumptions that irritate you? I'd say that veganism is ideal as far as like nutrition goes. Let's see. I don't know. I feel like in some sense, I've moved a little bit closer to some of the traditional health recommendations. For example, like when I really dug into the research on like cholesterol and its relationship to heart disease, I realized just how well researched it's been and how quality some of the data on that is. But at the same time, I do think some things like that are overemphasized. And I think there's a bit of an overemphasis on medication over lifestyle interventions. And there's a general lack of appreciation for these things, for the effects of like nutrients, for example, on pharmacology. Like people will treat mental illness with a drug when they could achieve the same effect more efficiently with like B vitamins or something like that. So in general, I think it's the lack of appreciation for certain nutrients and their benefits. And then at the same time, you also see an overemphasis of certain pathways or things over others. Let's see. Addendum to the dental question: have been carnivore for 12 months and started noting large amounts of enamel repair after 6 months. Also, pain from known cavities is gone. Gums beauteous too. That's interesting and honestly not surprising to me. A lot of the traditional people groups, like what they would eat according to Weston A. Price, this research that have like very good dental health, is a lot more like fiber rich, like root vegetables and things like that, like low sugar berries or fruits. Fruit's been bred even to be like 2, 3, 4, 5 times as high in sugar in some cases. So there's much higher fiber intake, much lower sugar intake, even in the form of fruit. There is still honey consumption, interestingly, and that doesn't seem to increase the risk as much. But I'm sure like if you had honey available every day and you just went crazy with it, you could still increase your cavities. But then there's a lot of like meat consumption too, but good quality meat that's not ridiculously high in iron or saturated fat or things too. Can egg whites be an issue for people recovering from SIBO and therefore excluded from the diet protocol? A lot of protocols do exclude egg whites. Like GAPS is a good example. Which is GAPS. You can look that up. It's a very well-known elimination protocol for the microbiome issues. And basically, it seems to be that some of the different proteins in egg whites can cause sensitivity. I'm not sure exactly like which proteins could cause that. I'd have to go back and check, but I believe it's some of the ones in the Avidin family. The raw eggs can have some antibacterial properties, so they may be beneficial depending on your situation for something like SIBO specifically, because the proteins are actually going to be maintained when you like take raw egg up until at least the point of the small intestine before they're broken down and absorbed. So you may actually get some antibacterial benefit from raw eggs like that, but it's going to be a case by case thing. And if they cause like a sensitivity issue or like an inflammatory response or something, then I'd say, better safe than sorry for the most part. what a lot of protocols do is they'll start off without them and introduce them gradually. Should we just avoid refined sucrose or fruits as well? In regards to dental health. So the fruit that you consume, like in theory, it would be possible to get up to the point where you're consuming enough sugar from fruit, especially like all at once, that you're having issues with the bacteria causing like acidity or cavities or something like that. But for the most part, I'd say it's not really an issue. I've heard some people say dried fruit might pass that threshold where it actually gets to the point where it can cause cavities, but I really don't think that it's going to be enough of an issue unless you're consuming like a ton of like very concentrated dried fruit, which usually has sugar added anyway. So it's like, even then, I think it can be pretty confounded. But in general, fruit is going to be fine. Like, I don't see any issue with fruit, especially like lower sugar fruits like citrus fruits or berries are going to be much, much healthier in pretty much every sense. Like, they're not going to impact blood sugar as much. In some cases, like sugar containing fruits even will have antibacterial properties that could be beneficial. So I would say probably not really. Refined sugar, or like maybe an excess of something like honey or another like alternative sweetener or something like that, would be problematic. Let's see. Can chronic postnasal drip be cured through diet or supplements? Some cases, mucus kind of overload can indicate inflammation. I'd say maybe not so much diet or supplements. There might be some you could use. Like there's a process, I believe it's called a nausea oil, where you basically use like a nasal drip with some like an essential oil blend. There's oils that are made for this, and it clears out your sinuses and reduces the inflammation. So you could kind of consider that a supplement. Sometimes you'll see increased mucus with like dairy or something if you're sensitive to it. But for the most part, the factor that I think influences it the most, it's really not discussed as much, is going to be air quality. So basically, I would just check like the air quality in your house, get as much like fresh air and things outside as possible. And if it's related to allergies, then you could also check your methylation status, because low levels of methylation can cause excess histamine activity and potentially like kind of an allergic response, like runny nose and things like that, pretty frequently too. Let's see. All right. I'm getting pretty tired here, guys. So just like, let's do a couple more questions here. I'll do maybe like 5 or 6 more, and then we'll wrap this up. So if you guys have any more questions, drop them now, and I'll do the next few, and then we will finish this up. And I'll try and upload the recording to YouTube. I believe I can do that, but I'm not 100% sure. I haven't done one of these on YouTube before. But if I can, it'll be available on my channel after the fact. So if you guys like hopped in late here and you want to see the first hour or two, then you can go and check that out on there. All right. Removing all massive practical problems, do you think everyone could live healthily on a vegan diet, assuming proper supplements like B12 and adequate protein? I think it'd be more trouble than it's worth. Like, you'd essentially have to build up to the point of like taking half your protein in the form of supplements. You'd have to take supplements for at least like 5 or 10 different nutrients and kind of nutrient-like compounds. I just don't think it'd be worth it. And I think some people are genetically predisposed to a little bit more like issues with this than others. So it's going to be a very kind of individual sensitive issue. Some people can do a vegan diet for like 10 years before they start to really break down. Other people, it's like only a few months. And it depends on like your B vitamin metabolism, your ability to recycle folate through MTHFR, your usage of protein, your metabolism and how high it is, that sort of thing. So for the vast majority of people, I don't think you're going to survive on a vegan diet very well for any length of time. For some, you can get away with it for longer if you take like a million different supplements and all this stuff. But there's only one place that I've ever seen that I think would really do a vegan diet like effectively, and that's called the Hippocrates Institute when I first got into like veganism and everything like that. Then I was very like, my interest was kind of piqued by this. And basically the Hippocrates Institute, they literally are like, this is like veganism for the wealthy. They will charge like hundreds and hundreds of dollars for supplements. And it's like these algae supplements that contain like the same amount of protein as like meat does and all these different nutrients and things like that. They have like advanced nutrition testing to spot deficiencies as quickly as possible to make sure people don't have them. It's like, if you don't have access to that, I don't think you can do veganism effectively. And the vast majority of people don't. So let's see. What does your daily macro breakdown usually look like? Let's see if I can pull it up. So I don't believe I have. I don't believe I have the like average, but I might be able to set up an average here. As I kind of mentioned to you guys, I use the nutrition tracking app Chronometer, so that's what I'm pulling this up with. But we'll see like what a sample one would look like. If I can find the last day I did one. I can't set it up to do today. Let me just find the last day that I tracked it. So, like as a sample day, or as like kind of an example here. So my ratio, I'm not sure exactly what it would be, but like on a day that I consumed a little bit less calories than I would try to normally, but about a little over 2,500. My split was about 27% protein, 32% carbs, and 41% fat. Now, you know, whether that's going to be the same every day, let's see. Some days is a little bit more or less, but usually it's about 20 something, like 25% protein, maybe 40% carbs, like 35% fat, something like that is usually my split. What are the other components to constant allergic reaction besides high histamine overmethylation? Look up hapten formation, Hapten. There's a website called My Biohack that has a really excellent article on it. Synthetic vitamin C as bad as people say it is. So basically the main argument with synthetic versus like whole food vitamin C is that when it comes to isolated ascorbic acid, there's like a camp of people that essentially believe that you don't get the same benefit because vitamin C in food has other kind of cofactors with it that make it more effective or are required for its proper function. And this is kind of true, kind of false. It's really just an exaggeration, in my opinion. So when you look at the cofactors and things that are present in vitamin C, first off, most of the ones that people try and say are cofactors that are required for its function aren't consistently present with it. I'd say if there was like a component of vitamin C, like if vitamin C was a combination of multiple molecules, you would always see those molecules combined together, but that's not the case. The molecules people pick out usually are flavonoids, which are mostly just found in like citrus fruits, a little bit in various vegetables and things like that too. But the specific ones that people try and link to vitamin C are mostly found in the fruit containing vitamin C and not like the vegetables or animal products. For example, if you look at the components in liver, if you look at vitamin C in liver, it's only ever going to contain just like ascorbic acid. So at the very least, animal source vitamin C is isolated ascorbic acid. And that tells me basically that when you look at the like use of vitamin C in the body, that it's nothing more than the ascorbic acid that's actually playing a role here. Now, the argument that people make with flavonoids is that they might like increase its bioavailability or have complementary effects like other antioxidant effects. And that's possibly the case. Yeah, I definitely could see some of them being beneficial in their own right. But there's nothing that's present with vitamin C inherently right off the bat. You know, at the very least, you see like the example of animal products that contain ascorbic acid, but nothing else. And then beyond that, you also don't really see anything with it that's going to be like I don't know, like that's going to make a real difference in how it's metabolized or anything. So personally, I believe that you can achieve benefit with synthetic vitamin C. I think the whole food sources will provide added benefit through like the flavonoid concentration that's going to be beneficial regardless. So, you know, if you have access to whole food sources or even like a whole food supplement, why not? But for the most part, it's really not, it's not going to make or break the benefits when it comes down to it. Let's see. Did you start experimenting with seafood / organ meat / eggs and cutting out the red meat at all? So I'm not sure if you're referring to this for sure, but the other day on Twitter, or like a month or two ago, actually, I mentioned something about how I think you could construct an ideal diet and hit all the nutrition with basically a combination of seafood and or maybe even just shellfish and organ meats and maybe like fish eggs or something. So I haven't tried that yet, but I think it would be definitely interesting. And I plan to sometime in the next year, but I'm not sure how it will fit with my goals as far as like fitness and bodybuilding and things like that go. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to really, you know, have the full range of access to all the like food that I can comfortably or easily get my protein from every day without including at least some other foods like that. So I'm going to have to probably get to a point where I'm a little bit more stable with my kind of fitness goals before I experiment with any huge dietary changes right off the bat. Because what I'm doing right now is working for what I'm trying to achieve. All right, I think this will be the last question I'll answer here. Thoughts on long-term or lifelong caloric restriction / OMAD. Supposedly good for longevity. It's a fly in here. Supposedly good for longevity, but are there drawbacks and is it sustainable long term? So basically, when it comes to caloric restriction, I have a lecture on this actually on my Patreon. It's basically like if you search longevity on there, you should find it. But essentially, the most well-researched kind of health benefit or I guess like route for achieving benefits to longevity is actually caloric restriction. Now, we don't have the human data to look at longevity for the most part. Like really, there's no good way to do this. We have things like reducing iron intake that we know that reduce mortality from common things like heart disease. So there's some like shorter scale things like that. Like some of the studies on heart disease risk factors go for like 10 or 15 years, but there has never been a study that's gone for like 80 or 100 years to see like what causes people to live longer or shorter, things like that. I don't know if there's one being conducted. Be kind of cool if there is, but really for the most part, all of this stuff is studied in other mammals or like lower animals like nematodes and things like that. So when it comes to caloric restriction, I think the mechanisms likely carry over into humans, but it's not going to guarantee you a long life. You know, there's other things too. Like you could do like a caloric restricted diet and eat a bunch of iron and saturated fat and all these other things. Like you'd be a smoker and it's not going to make a difference. You're like really just picking different risk factors, and you can either reduce or increase them. Like if you minimize all the different like risk factors for mortality across the board, like you're saying, I'm not going to smoke, I'm not going to drink alcohol, or I'm going to minimize alcohol consumption to only like a couple times a week or something, and even just like a single serving a couple times a week. I'm going to like exercise regularly. I'm going to limit my red meat intake. I'm going to increase like olive oil and that sort of thing. And you just went through and like maximize everything, then you probably see a meaningful result. But if you just change one thing like that and you don't change anything else, or even like you have poor lifestyle habits in general and you just change like one or two things for the positive, it's not going to be as noticeable of an effect. So humans are very complex organisms. Like there's a ton of factors that affect our health. So you could have like the perfect diet, you could exercise daily, and you could still get sick from like some freak thing or some genetic illness. So really, when it comes down to it, I think it's a matter of making the choices that you can while still living your life to the best of your ability, living it comfortably, at least as much as possible. You know, you're gonna have to sacrifice comfort for health in some areas, like exercise and not gorging yourself on junk food and all that. But when it comes down to it, I think really you're going to see the best results with just kind of generally making the larger changes that you can and just going from there, kind of working towards the most well-rounded approach that you can through a combination of everything. And that's really my goal. You know, if I don't live till 90 or 100, I'm okay with that. But if I can preserve the quality of my life for however long I do live, that's what really matters to me. So that's about it. I think we can wrap this up now. I appreciate you guys sitting through this and asking some really interesting questions and just participating in general. This was really fun. I'll try and upload the recording if it was recorded. I'm not sure, but I'll try and upload the recording to my YouTube. So if you guys missed part of this or most of it or any portion of it, then hopefully we can go back through and you guys can watch the kind of replay of it. But if not, I mentioned this earlier, but I'm also doing another Q&A for just like Patreon subscribers on Thursday. So if you guys aren't able to view the replay, if I'm not able to get that figured out, and you want to like go back and view some of the old Q&As I've done on there, or you want another one, then that's going to be up there next in like a couple days. So, and that one I can do a replay on because I use a different service for that one. But anyway, thank you guys for hanging out and asking some fantastic questions. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your evenings.